join us today. We have planned an interactive 90-minute program. All of those who have joined us participants are muted, but you will be able to post questions to our speakers through the Q&A function. We will first hear from our speakers and then address as many of your questions as possible during the Q&A segment. We encourage you to submit your questions throughout the program and also encourage you to engage with our global audience through social media and share messages from our speakers. Today's dialogue will focus on the complex issue of managing migration within the context of climate and environmental change. We will also talk about identifying expected patterns as the climate crisis intensifies, as well as what must be done to protect the most vulnerable populations. To kick things off, it is my pleasure to introduce Luca Delolio, CEO of USA for IOM. Over to you, Luca.
Good morning, Tolo. It's a pleasure to see you and to be with you today and on this important event. Good morning from Washington, D.C., and good afternoon and good evening around the world. Thank you for joining us. I would like to welcome you on behalf of USA for IOM and IOM, the International Organization for Migration. We are the UN agency dedicated to migration, displacement, and all aspects of human mobility. USA for IOM is IOM's non-governmental partner in the United States, aimed at mobilizing the American private sector in support of IOM's activities and raising awareness among the public to advance innovative, evidence-based solutions that address migrants' vulnerabilities, particularly those caused by conflict and complex emergencies, smuggling and trafficking human beings, and environmental degradation and natural disasters. The purpose of this dialogue is to raise awareness across sectors on the need for addressing human mobility in the context of the climate change agenda and identify action-oriented initiatives. In light of the growing importance of climate migration as a global issue, IOM calls for action on two fronts to support states and migrants impacted by the adverse consequences of climate change. On the one hand, the international community should support states vulnerable to climate change to invest in climate action to avert, minimize, and address the negative impacts of climate change that contribute to displacement. Climate action should aim in particular at increasing people's resilience and reducing their exposure to risk with a view to minimizing displacement. On the other hand, it is also important to encourage the development of innovative migration options, including using existing legal pathways for migration and developing new migration pathways for people severely affected by climate change impacts. Last week marked the official end of the record-breaking 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, a season characterized by 30 storms, more than double the normal average, with devastating effects throughout Central America, North America, and the Caribbean. Today, more than ever, we call upon practitioners, policymakers, and partners to join us in action-oriented dialogue to discuss collaborative solutions that, through a whole-of-society approach, mitigate the impact of climate events on the most vulnerable people and countries. We would like to offer additional avenues and opportunities for engagement from the private sector and the American people to bear witness to the devastating human impact of climate change as driver of forced migration and join us in being part of the solution to a common challenge. The migration environmental nexus is not a new one. The environment has always been one of the major drivers of migration. However, climate change significantly increases its current and future relevance. Like many other global crises, the burden will not be shared equally. The most vulnerable populations, such as the economically disadvantaged, women, children, older persons, indigenous people, and mobile or displaced population will bear the brunt of environmental impact. Having fewer resources and options for adaptation in situ, these groups tend to experience the greatest outmigration pressures because of environmental, economic, and social impacts of climate change. In this context, IOM aims to support communities affected by climate change in adapting their livelihoods, ensuring their migration remains an option, and not a choice, not a necessity. Increasing the range of available options is key to those most affected by climate change, reduces their vulnerability in the short, medium, and long run. To accomplish this outcome, there is a need to develop comprehensive policies and programmatic approaches at both international level, with a strong focus on adaptation and resilience to current and future.
Maybe you should see this thing.
Sorry, there's a few voices on the background. Just to reinforce this point, to accomplish this outcome, there is a need to develop comprehensive policies and programmatic approaches at both international and national level, with a strong focus on adaptation and resilience to current and future climate impact. This is especially urgent for small island developing states which face an existential threat. On December 2nd, the UN Secretary General, speaking at Columbia University's World Leader Forum on the state of our planet, emphatically called for dramatically scaling up ambitions on climate change and for protecting the most vulnerable. We already have a blueprint, he reminded us: the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. In response to these challenging times, the UN's Regional Office for Central and North America and the Caribbean and USA for IOM are convening this forum, Climate and Human Mobility, from Understanding to Action. This event aims to foster meaningful collaboration across UN agencies, philanthropic organizations, and the private sector to identify further modalities for collaborative action in this region. Hurricanes Eta and Iota will produce long-lasting effects and should serve as yet another reminder of the urgency of addressing these challenges. And now, it is my honor to introduce Mr. Owais Sarmat, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a key player on a broad range of diplomatic and strategic issues relating to intergovernmental affairs and planning of the UNFCCC processes. He provides oversight to the overall operations of the UNFCCC, covering human and financial resources, as well as organizational development. Previously serving as the Chief of Staff of the International Organization for Migration, Mr. Sarmat has worked in several management and policy capacities at IOM over a period of 27 years. I had the pleasure to work with Owais in a number of countries severely affected by large-scale emergencies. I witnessed his thoughtful and yet passionate approach to addressing seemingly intractable complexities. Without further ado, I give the floor to our keynote speaker, Owais Sarmat, Deputy Executive Secretary, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Luca. Luca, it's great to see you, and thank you for those very kind and generous words. Thank you. I really appreciate this. It's really my pleasure to join you and to see my friend Michelle Klein, who's also on the panel today. And very importantly, with all my deep respect to Mr. Jim Purcell, the Director General of IOM, when I actually started with IOM. So this is an important event, and brings back a lot of good memories of my work with IOM some years ago, and now here I am with United Nations Climate Change, and addressing this very important issue and topic of climate change, and in relation to also human mobility. So let me share our perspective on this topic. This is, as I said, this topic is very dear to me personally, because of my work in IOM, and since then, for the last 3 years with UN Climate Change Secretariat. To start with, as we are all dealing with the COVID pandemic that has created new challenges and also uncertainties for all of us. And I really truly hope everyone who's listening to us are safe, well, and we all hope we'll come out of this very soon, hopefully safely, and actually more stronger and resilient. So climate change has not taken a break during this pandemic. In fact, it is just speeding up in terms of global emissions. And we say that although there will be a vaccine for COVID, there cannot be a vaccine for climate change. So we need to do everything we can to address the threats and impacts of climate change. And how to do that? We have all the tools, we have the mechanisms, we have the political decisions around the world, which all of that has been captured in the Paris Agreement. And in fact, just to let you know, we will be celebrating 5 years anniversary of Paris Agreement coming Saturday. So there is a lot of talk about how far we have come since Paris. So I'll briefly share those perspectives with you. The main and central goal of Paris Agreement was and still remains to limit global warming below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees below the pre-industrial level. The scientific community, and there is the IPCC process, which has warned repeatedly that there is only 10 years now for global warming to be kept to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, beyond which even half a degree will significantly worsen the risk of drought, floods, extreme heat, poverty for hundreds of millions of people. Sadly, this also means forced migration for people living in these vulnerable areas, including internal displacement. Today, I plan to focus my reflections on 3 main topics: the role of multilateralism in addressing climate change, including the response by our organization, and the climate change and human mobility nexus in that context. And secondly, the role of non-party stakeholders, many of you who have joined today, including some specific suggestions on what the private sector in particular can do to contribute and benefit from the expected transformation that we are working towards. So first and foremost, something that we refer to as inclusive multilateralism. And here, climate change is about one thing: survival of humanity. Addressing climate change is simply too large for one group or one nation or even all nations. There are 197 parties to the climate change agreement, take away 1 or 2 for a short period of time. But it is with this understanding that UN climate change is moved beyond simple multilateralism to the concept of inclusive multilateralism, which is about working together as governments and what we refer to in our process as non-party stakeholders, which include businesses, subnational governments, cities, regions, and individuals, to address all aspects of climate change. I'll get back to this a bit later, but let me now move on to the climate change and human mobility nexus. As you're all aware, climate change and migration are both very high on the agenda of policymakers around the world. These 2 issues are defining topics in political debates in many regions and countries of the world. But let's take a look at the facts first. Many of you know that according to the IDMC, we saw 33 million new displacements in 2019 alone. And here is an important indicator. 25 million of those were displaced by weather-related events. That is almost 75% of new displacements in 2019. Extreme weather events such as tornadoes, the floods, as well as slow onset events such as sea level rise, affect every region of the world. And it doesn't matter if it's a developing, or country in transition. While tornadoes and floods can be classified as direct causal factors for human mobility, there are other that are more indirect but equally result in huge human mobility and displacement. Climate change is projected to negatively impact agriculture, water, many other sectors that humans depend on for livelihood. This translates to weakened economies and increased conflict, thus forcing humans in these hard-hit areas to move beyond their habitual places of residence. Human mobility, as we all know, and that's very well known in IOM terminology, that it's an age-old adaptation strategy. Historically, as we know, we have experienced when humans have been faced with natural or man-made disasters, they have responded by migrating to places perceived to be safer. If we do not change current climate change trajectories, the future will not be any different. By this, what I'm saying is that clarifying the link between climate change and human displacement, and by designing policies under the scope of Global Compact on Migration so that they can respond to both challenges in an integrated and a cohesive fashion. And what are we doing in our organization? We are taking many actions. We understand, first and foremost, how climate change is impacting people and are determined to facilitate the implementation of urgent and ambitious climate action. We support both parties, governments, and non-party stakeholders, and there are many companies, corporations, cities who are working very closely with us to pave the way to a world that will be safer, a world that provides a dignified and a sustainable future for people. More specifically, let me point out to some concrete areas. Implementation of the Paris Agreement is the centerpiece of the global response to climate change, and that engages us day and night. It functions as a blueprint for how governments and other actors should work together to collectively address the crisis. And as the custodian of the Paris Agreement, we'll work with expert groups to provide technical support to the parties. The task force on displacement is one of those. When Global Compact on Migration was being considered in Marrakesh in 2018, our organization was in parallel considering the recommendations of that particular task force on displacement in Poland, which included, and I quote, to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility for people, as appropriate in accordance with national laws and policies, and it goes on. So those were decisions that were taken in full recognition of the importance of the nexus between climate change and migration. In short, we need to do things smarter, cleaner, and better. And this is not a threat. It is an opportunity and a promise for a better world. Now, where do the investors, companies, corporations, and non-party stakeholders, as we refer to, where do they come in? Let me revert to the concept of inclusive multilateralism that I mentioned earlier, which is a central part of the response to climate change. While public-private partnerships are not new, the role that non-party stakeholders are playing in UN climate change is innovative and it's growing. The private sector, subnational authorities, and philanthropic organizations are voluntarily taking on commitments in the process to address climate change at the highest level, to provide the support needed for ambitious climate actions. Companies are as vulnerable and exposed to forced migration as they are to impacts of climate change, both in actual operations and in their reputation, which is key to success for all of them. I also see a huge opportunity here for the private sector to engage in. Firstly, preventing future climate change impacts. Here I see non-party stakeholders, and many of you who are joined today, playing a key role in efforts to curb emissions through initiatives like our Race to Zero campaign, which is designed to build the momentum needed to shift to a decarbonized economy ahead of next year's climate summit, which is referred to as COP26. The Race to Zero mobilizes a coalition of leading net zero initiatives, which currently has a membership of 452 cities, 22 regions, more than 1,100 businesses, 45 of the biggest investors, and 550 universities around the world. And those actors involved currently, listen to this, cover over 50% of the global GDP and 25% of global emissions. Our global climate action platform has recently registered more than 27,000 activities and initiatives by non-party stakeholders. And I invite you all to look at that and consider joining them. Similarly, we have also brought together entire sectors in industries, in fashion, in tourism, in sports, to support them to undertake concerted efforts to bring those sectors and industries in line with the Paris Agreement. There are significant investments directed to this work thanks to these initiatives. The second opportunity for private sector is nestled in the fact that transforming our economies will bring a huge opportunity for the private sector. A green, clean, and sustainable society will require new sets of skills, and technology. And here is an interesting paradox. When the Gulf countries discovered oil many years ago and began to exploit it, it attracted migrants from many parts of the world. Today, building green and sustainable cities is providing many opportunities for dignified, orderly, safe, and humane migration. And this trend is expected to exponentially grow. We strongly believe that, and we're seeing trends of that in that direction. I see the pursuit of green and sustainable cities creating migration corridors, which will prevent forced migration and prevent trafficking. And what is it specifically that you all can do? Private sector should leverage this phenomenon and work with different stakeholders to connect migrants with relevant skills to the green job that will emerge from the transformation that is underway. For example, as innovative thinkers as you are, I see you looking ahead to identify training opportunities and to develop technologies which should assist the youth who can become potential migrants to find gainful employment either in their home countries to lead safe lives, or should they decide to migrate voluntarily, it can be done in a planned and an orderly manner. More recently, we are beginning to see innovative approaches such as government of Fiji, Climate Relocation Displacement People's Trust Fund to support the relocation of up to 800 communities who are at immediate threat of sea level rise. The fund is attracting funding from diversity of sources. There are examples of crowdfunding initiatives to support climate insurance, for instance, to help vulnerable communities and immediate relief to disaster-related migration. Ladies and gentlemen, we stand at a cusp of transformational moment in history, a moment future generations will identify as pivotal, one that moved us from one era to the next. It is entirely possible, but we have to act now. Now, will we choose to go back to the normal where global temperatures were rising on a pace to more than double by the end of the century? Or will we choose not to build back better, as some say, but build forward, to enact policies that promote green growth, protect biodiversity, embrace renewable energy, make society safe, and much more than that? We have the policies, the technological know-how, and the resilience of people behind us. This is the greatest opportunity to mobilize all actors to reshape our recovery. Working together with all actors and governments, the businesses, and so on, a green recovery is just not possible, but totally achievable. Let me share a good example. In the 1980s, scientists proved there was an enormous hole in our ozone layer. It posed a common threat to all of us. Nations acted, worked multilaterally, signed the Montreal Protocol, and today the science shows that ozone layer has been repaired. It is never too hard, it's never too late. The challenge is never too big, too complex, or too difficult. That's not in our nature, that's not who we are. Instead, let us work together to overcome climate change and thus eliminate associated direct and indirect effects on forced human mobility. The Paris Agreement has the full potential to get us together and write the comeback story of the century, and we can be all part of that. I once again thank all my colleagues in IOM. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you, and we'll look forward to hearing any comments or questions you may have. Once again, thank you, Luca, thank you, Michelle, thank you, our good colleague Tolu, for being the master of ceremony, and once again, Mr. Purcell. It's a great honor to have you, sir, in this, in IOM, USA for IOM. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Oveis. Thank you, Luca, for that stirring introduction. It is clear that this is an important moment for the humanitarian and international community to intensify our collaboration. sharing knowledge, welcoming new partners, and leveraging the actions of governments to promote resilience with vulnerable communities at the center of addressing this existential threat of climate change. It is my pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Michelle Klein-Solomon, IOM Regional Director for Central and North America and the Caribbean. Prior to her current position, Michelle served as the first director of the newly established Policy Hub in the Office of the Director General at IOM. The Policy Hub is designed to draw together and deliver policy knowledge across the organization. From 2016 to 2018, she was the director of the Global Compact for Migration at IOM, leading IOM's support to states and partners in the development and implementation of the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Tolu, and good morning, dear colleagues and friends. It is truly a great pleasure to be here with you today to co-host this important event organized by USA for IOM on climate resilience and the recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me start by extending my appreciation to USAI for IOM colleagues for organizing this webinar, to the presenters who have accepted the invitation to intervene, and most especially to my dear friend and former colleague, Ove Sarmat, Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. Ove, it's terrific to see you here today, and I think we were all inspired by your words. And I would like to take a page from your book and thank Jim Purcell for being with us as well, a key former Director General of IOM and leader of this charitable organization. Thank you all for the invitation to be here today. It goes without saying how timely today's webinar is, and I'll be offering you a perspective from the region that I cover now, Central and North America and the Caribbean. You will all know that last month, Hurricanes Eta and Iota tore through the countries of Central America, wreaking havoc along large areas in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. Scientific predictions had foreseen a terribly active 2020 hurricane season, and climate change evidence points to increasingly intense and frequent tropical storms. This became true, most sadly, last month, as it had been true in the Caribbean in 2017. The question is not whether disasters will happen. The question is when they will happen and where. Moving towards a longer-term perspective and the COVID scenario, I'd like to specifically address 3 issues that are crucial from an IOM perspective. First, I believe it is fundamental to acknowledge the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on migration in general and climate migration in particular. As we all know, the pandemic has resulted in the closure of borders and movement restrictions across the world. In Central American countries, where mobility is often a way of life and communities are used to moving to access employment, movement restrictions have had a critical impact on local livelihoods. This has been compounded by the prevalence of informality in the labor market and the lack of social protection nets, rendering many individuals and households extremely vulnerable to poverty. Under these circumstances, Alicia Bárcena, the Executive Secretary of the UN's Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, warned that the pandemic could mean another lost decade for Latin America and the Caribbean, with a recession of 14 years in terms of poverty levels. While it is, of course, still quite early to have a clear understanding of how the pandemic interacts with climate migration, I think there are a few issues to be highlighted. When disasters struck our region, it has been extremely difficult to provide protection and ensure adequate response to the pandemic scenario, where prevention efforts have been required through all stages of displacement. As just two critical examples, in Honduras and Nicaragua, populations in shelters from the storm have limited access to both protective equipment and social distancing opportunities, leaving them even more vulnerable to disease transmission. At the same time, remittances have historically been one of the ways in which migration can contribute to climate change adaptation. Remittances sent home by migrants help their families adapt. But there have been fears with the COVID-19 pandemic that there would be a severe loss of remittances and therefore the resilience capacity of vulnerable communities would be negatively impacted. What we have seen, surprisingly and blessedly, is that migrants have proven to be extremely resilient. And the latest figures from central banks in Central America show the stability of these transfers even in the current crisis context. Now, the long-term impact of the pandemic remains unknown, and we will all collectively have to be very attentive to how the situation created by COVID-19 affects migration movements in interaction with environmental drivers. My second point, I'd like to underscore the specific exposure and vulnerability of Central American countries to the adverse impacts of climate change and the repercussions of this on human mobility. In the last years, the major climate story in Central America was one related to droughts and how food insecurity contributed to triggering migration from the dry corridor areas of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. This, of course, has radically changed in the last few weeks, and we are now confronted with the destructive impact of two hurricanes that have devastated Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. This is unfortunately not a new scenario, as Hurricanes Mitch and Felix can attest, but serves as a reminder of the critical exposure of Central American populations to a variety of natural hazards. There is evidence that most instances of displacement due to natural hazards are related to hydrometeorological events. These are situations where too much, or conversely, not enough water render areas uninhabitable, destroy houses, and affect livelihoods. The compounded impact of drought, land degradation, and sudden storms are often overwhelming for vulnerable communities, requiring ambitious and consistent efforts in climate adaptation and resilience to reduce the pressure of forced migration. Migration can be, as Ove so rightly highlighted, an adaptation strategy to environmental change in Central America. But the conditions in which it happens are what make all the difference. Whereas resilience is in place and migration is an option and not an obligation, households can move to better conditions and move more positive outcomes. We can create virtuous circles. In exposed communities, however, where limited options are available, displacement becomes an obligation when disaster strikes, and a vicious cycle of vulnerability settles in. Finally, I would like to urge you to consider the importance, as Ove did, of building partnerships to address environment migration together. There is an often repeated sentence in international migration negotiations which says that no country can adequately address migration alone. And as Oves can clearly attest, the same is often said in climate discussions, as indeed climate change is a threat that extends beyond the borders of any individual country. Environmental migration challenges require, therefore, all of us to build new partnerships, extend our alliances, and break down silos that impede collaboration, innovation, and cooperation. In this vein, from IOM's side, we've been working closely with colleagues in the UNFCCC and including and specifically in UNFCCC to map and understand how migration can be better mainstreamed in climate strategies and plans. IOM is a member of the UNFCCC Task Force on Displacement, and our joint engagement looks at ways to support countries in reducing the pressures and addressing environmental migration from a policy standpoint. Groundbreaking synergies have also been built with UN Environment. As just one example, a joint project is currently being implemented in Guatemala to look at how to tackle the environmental impacts of migration together with humanitarian assistance. In today's webinar, we'll hear from our efforts with UN Environment to assess the situation of environmental migration in the 7 countries of Central America and Mexico. This is an important effort because it has led us to identify a series of priorities and opportunities for action, which we will present today to improve the management of these movements. And this responds directly to one of the questions that has already been raised in the chat by one of our participants. However, partnerships on environmental migration within the UN system alone are clearly not enough. Governments are obvious key stakeholders and partners in addressing this issue, and progress has been recorded in Central America that merits acknowledgement. Here, I would like to call attention to countries like Guatemala and Honduras, who have committed to better approach environmental migration in their climate strategies. IOM is also working with Belize in including migration and climate plans, and Costa Rica is integrating human mobility in its revised nationally determined contribution. I believe these efforts should be praised and supported as meaningful action on environmental migration as countries start recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. But of course, beyond international organizations and governments, and as was so well underscored by Oves, civil society and the private sector have essential roles to play in this endeavor. Calling particular attention to the private sector, I would like to identify the crucial role private sector plays in building resilience, as our discussions will demonstrate today. Through regular labor migration, the private sector can offer vulnerable households opportunities to diversify their incomes. In Costa Rica, for example, where our regional office is located and from where I'm speaking to you today, an agreement was signed a month ago to enable 40,000 Nicaraguan nationals to work temporarily in the coffee industry. Similar agreements are in place in many countries, and they provide a chance for communities to gain incomes that can support climate adaptation. The private sector can also offer resilient solutions in place for communities who are suffering from degradation of their livelihoods. Building synergies between these efforts and IOM's work on migration, environment, and climate change can have a critical multiplier effect for the well-being of populations who have suffered tremendously these recent years from natural hazards, the impacts of climate change, and now exacerbated by the pandemic. I thank you very much for your attention. Again, thank my colleagues at USA for IOM for supporting this effort, and to Oves for your brilliant keynote address. I fully expect we will have a vibrant and substantive discussion going forward, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for those remarks. And I'd like to take a moment now to also recognize my fellow board members that are here, including the chairman of the board, Mr. Purcell, and fellow board member, Carol Fitter. Thank you both for being here today. Now, as an introduction to our panel on climate migration in Central America and the Caribbean, I would like to share a campaign that embodies IOM's commitment to finding solutions in the face of adversity. Find a Way is IOM's global initiative focusing on the resilience and strength of those migrating due to the climate crisis.
The earth is changing. Summers are getting warmer. Winters are much colder. Hurricanes, floods, storms, and droughts are increasing in intensity. The climate is changing, and many people are being forced to move and adapt like never before. In the face of adversity and nature's fury, we need to find a way to protect, preserve, and persevere. Join IOM in helping people around the world be more resilient to climate change. Together, we will find a way.
Well, friends and colleagues, while this video paints a bleak picture, we have the chance to transform humankind's relationship with the natural world and with each other. But to achieve all that we have to work together, which leads us into our panel discussion, where you will hear from experts from IOM, UNFCCC, the World Resources Institute, and the Clara Lionel Foundation. First up, we have Rebecca Kata, Deputy Director, Climate Resilience Practice at the World Resources Institute. Rebecca focuses on governance issues related to climate resilience, including the transparency, equity, and inclusivity of adaptation planning and implementation processes. Her work encompasses mainstreaming adaptation across sectors and at multiple scales from national to local, climate finance, as well as transformative adaptation. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Tolu, and it's a real pleasure to be here today to speak to everyone on this extremely important and timely panel. I guess I'd like to start off by, oh, I'm sorry, Tolu, did you want to introduce each panelist or shall I go ahead?
Please, go ahead. So I'd actually love for you to start with, to look at the current state of play and then the future. Could you give us your perspective on how communities are currently being affected by climate change and the importance of migration in the years ahead?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So when we look around the world at ways that communities are being affected by climate change, we see a range of different impacts. For some, those impacts are fairly moderate, slightly higher temperatures, more erratic rainfall, more severe flooding, longer, more intense droughts. But, you know, adaptation measures are starting to be implemented that are really making a difference in these communities, making them more resilient. Most of the types of adaptation measures we see being implemented are what we and the IPCC actually defines as incremental adaptations. And the idea is to preserve existing systems with these adaptation measures. So for farmers, which is what a lot of our research focuses on, this might mean growing new varieties of the same crops, changing cultivation techniques, you know, changing the timing of planting or harvesting, measures like that. And these measures are extremely important and must be better supported to enable farmers and others to stay on their land. But in other places, we're already beginning to see more severe climate change impacts, and some of them are making it difficult for people to continue with their current livelihoods or even to continue living in the same places. And these are impacts of things like permanent desertification, reduced water supplies, sea level rise causing more flooding, aquifers that are becoming too salty to use. In these kinds of situations, a different type of approach to adaptation is needed. And this is what the IPCC calls transformative adaptation. And here we're recognizing that existing systems cannot always be preserved, and so we actually need to create new systems. When we think about what that means for agricultural systems, for example, this might mean farmers be learning to grow entirely new crops, shifting from crop-based agriculture to aquaculture, or using new technologies in ways that they haven't before, like polyhouses, where they can protect their crops from severe hailstorms and use irrigation more effectively. What we've learned in our research is that these transformative changes are very difficult for many farmers to make on their own. And not surprisingly, it's the farmers who have more wealth, more land, better access to information and credit, who are able to make these changes on their own. For the rest of the farmers, and especially the more vulnerable smallholder producers, they're going to need more support to make these really significant shifts. So that they do have the option to stay on their land if that is the choice that they want to make. But at the same time, even if this kind of support is provided, even if we scale up these transformative approaches to adaptation, there will still be situations where farmers will not be able to make these shifts, and locations where adaptation reaches its limits, and we will just need, people will need the option to move. There may be nothing that they can grow that would provide adequate incomes for them. And these are cases where migration comes in. This is an option that should be available to farmers. And we have improved our understanding of the data and climate projections enough to begin using it better than we have been to focus on where these kinds of options are going to be most necessary and begin making those transitions in ways that give us enough lead time to involve local communities in the decision making about what their futures will look like.
Thank you, Rebecca. You've conducted research on transformative adaptation in a range of geographies and productive sectors. Could you highlight a few relevant facts and conclusions about autonomous agricultural production shifts in Central America?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So this is what I started mentioning, with not all farmers being able to make these changes on their own. And I'd like to walk you through a case study of where we see a government beginning to take some effective action to address this gap and bring those farmers who might otherwise be left behind along with these changes that need to happen. So the government of Costa Rica is emerging as a real leader in this space and in supporting transformative adaptation. It's one of the few countries that we found that mentions the need for transformative change in its national adaptation plan. This case study focuses on coffee because it is a crop that's extremely temperature sensitive. Even slight increases in heat can decrease production. And it's also a crop that's extremely important to both the livelihoods of millions of people in Costa Rica and other countries in Central America, but also their identity. It's really central to the culture in many places. So I and my colleagues, Stephanie Tai and Delfina Greenspan, have had the pleasure of working in Costa Rica with the Ministries of Agriculture and Environment over the past couple of years. And so looking at this map, what we've done is map out, using data generated by Costa Rican researchers, how the suitability of coffee as a crop, according to the environmental changes we expect, changes. This map goes out to 2050 under a low emission scenario, in other words, best case scenario, with no adaptation interventions. And you can see that there are a few places that become more suitable for coffee production. Those are the green areas. But I should point out that much of that land is in protected areas, so it's unlikely to be available for coffee production. These areas that you see there, gray or yellow, are where coffee production can continue to be viable based on these incremental measures that I mentioned earlier, these fairly minor adjustments that farmers can begin employing to preserve their existing coffee production systems. So things like shade trees, windbreaks, different mulching techniques, better on-farm water management, there are options available to them. And the Costa Rican government is trying to understand better how to help other farmers who are not making these changes on their own begin to make them and what kind of support they need. But they're also recognizing what is likely to happen in these orange areas that you see on the map. These are places that are already, in some cases, rather marginal for coffee production, and it's going to just become increasingly difficult, even with those incremental measures I mentioned to continue making a viable living with coffee production. If you look up in the top left corner of the map, that's Guanacaste. That's an area where we're actually seeing some farmers begin to make transformative shifts on their own. What they're doing is shifting over to citrus production. They have found that this is a crop that grows better in the new environmental conditions. But not surprisingly, when we look more closely at which farmers are able to make the switch, we find that it is the ones who have a little more land on which to begin experimenting with new crops, better access to credit and information on how to grow new crops. And so I think a really important question becomes how to support the farmers who have fewer resources to make these significant transformative changes on their own. And so I want to stress that, you know, in our research, Costa Rica really does stand out as a government that is trying to take a more proactive, transformative perspective. And this is what it looks like there. They're trying to get ahead of the curve before coffee farmers just hit a wall where they cannot stay in business by providing them with more options, including new crops, including markets for different types of crops, the information that they need, access to credit, all these different systemic changes that they would need to be able to stay on their land. But I think it's also important to note that as we look into the future, you know, and especially as we look at other emission scenarios where we don't manage to curb emissions as quickly as we need to, more choices will need to be available. And some of those choices should include migration. Farmers should have as many choices as possible in how they and their families are going to deal with these types of changes, and also have the ability to understand them, to have the information that they need to make those kinds of decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for sharing those insights from the adaptation research community. Your work demonstrates the crucial need to accelerate identification of vulnerable systems and implement transformative pathways. Thank you so much. Now, I'd like to explore this a bit more by bringing in our next panelist, Justine Lucas, Executive Director of Rihanna's Clara Lionel Foundation. For those unfamiliar with the work of this incredible foundation, CLF supports and funds education, emergency response, and climate resilience programs across the world. Justine, we're so happy to have you here today. Now, I would love to start by having you share how CLF is harnessing the power of philanthropy to help climate vulnerable communities prepare for and withstand disasters.
Thank you, Tolu, and thank you, IOM, for facilitating this conversation. It's really wonderful to be here. I think, like many NGOs operating in the Caribbean, a lot of them are, you know, faced with the fact that natural disasters are just routinely affecting those populations. And at CLF, our founder being from Barbados, we had always focused on the Caribbean. And after the 2017 hurricane season with Maria and Irma, we found ourselves doing a lot of emergency response. And as you all know, emergency response can be really disjointed. It's not equitable, it's not sustainable. And we felt like, given that we will be working in the Caribbean for the foreseeable future, we felt like we needed to look at resilience initiatives, look at the sustainability of our work, and how we engage in climate resilience in the face of the natural disasters that the Caribbean is facing. So we took a bit of a step back. We looked at the role that we as a moderately sized NGO could play in the face of climate change, and really found that, you know, with looking at our role in the face of governments and multilaterals operating in the region, we felt like we could play a role when it came to a few different areas of access to sustainable sources. So like health clinics, schools as shelters, and community resilience initiatives. We felt like, in a way that was very much pan-Caribbean, we could pilot projects that were really supporting communities at the level that they needed sustainable access to resources. So we launched a climate resilience initiative, which is a $25 million pan-Caribbean initiative where we are hardening, equipping with renewable energy, stockpiled supplies, health clinics, schools, and we are working on communications challenges across the Caribbean really looking at the role that women play in coordinating before, during, and after a natural disaster. So the goal of the initiative really is to pilot these projects across the islands, and then we're partnering with governments, multilaterals, to take the pilots to scale. Ultimately, the goal is how can the Caribbean become a climate resilient zone that is a model for the rest of the world. I have to say, from a philanthropic perspective, it has been a challenge to move funders from wanting to engage in emergency response to investing in climate resilience. I think it's sort of embedded historically that when a natural disaster occurs, we have sort of this gut reaction wanting to give funds, give supplies, but oftentimes that reaction, it dries up quite quickly and communities are left picking up the pieces for years to come. And so moving people, moving philanthropy, high net worth individuals, corporates, into a space of wanting to invest in resilience, wanting to build back better, really looking at climate change as something that is affecting communities, marginalized communities right now, and offering an opportunity for them to invest and provide resources in this moment. I think it's been a challenge, and but I can say that our climate resilience initiative has received a majority of its funding, and it's something we are working on across the Caribbean over the next 5 years. We have pilot projects in Dominica, Dominican Republic, Belize, Barbados, and we will be working in many countries in the years to come.
Thank you, Justine. So clearly, small island nations are staring down the barrel of this existential threat if the climate crisis is not addressed collectively and urgently. You mentioned just now how it's difficult to shift the money from being reactive to proactive. What's your take on how we can promote long-term resilience, social equity, and sustainability towards an effective and collective response at a global scale, especially for those that are most in need?
Thanks, Tolu. I think, from our perspective, the conversation on a global level has really been focused on mitigation. Outside of this wonderful group of people, I think that climate resilience is a hot button term. It's something that folks are talking about, but I think there hasn't been a lot of proper investment. Again, it's difficult to take people on a journey of understanding the importance of preparedness, but I think proper investment needs to happen at a global level. The goal with the Climate Resilience Initiative that we created really is I think philanthropy's role is often to pilot projects. We are able to take that risk, and then the role of government, of corporations, of multilaterals really is to take those pilots to scale and to think about the bigger picture. So I think the first thing I would say is that there needs to be increased investment in resilience. And I think a project like the Climate Resilience Initiative that we have through CLF is a really good opportunity to take a particular region in the world, prove that climate resilience can be achieved, and then take that to other regions that are particularly vulnerable to natural disasters. So I think that's the first thing, moving the global conversation and actual increase of investments from those entities. I would also say that one thing that we've seen in the Caribbean is the renewable energy transition is another big piece that needs to occur in an equitable way. And I think that global entities are really essential to make that happen. We've had some really interesting conversations with progressive governments such as Norway and Canada about that transition. And we have some really wonderful partners on the ground. In the Caribbean, we've seen firsthand that oftentimes that transition doesn't happen in an equitable way. And it really affects those most marginalized when it doesn't. So, for example, in an island where more wealthy entities are transitioning, it's driving up the electricity costs for those most vulnerable. And as we all know, the electricity costs in general in the Caribbean are quite high. So our theory of change as it relates to our initiative is, how can we take the most essential services like health clinics? For us, we started with reproductive health clinics, schools? How do we make sure that we start with essential services for the renewable energy transition, make sure that happens, it's an important piece of the puzzle, and then grow it across islands? So I think that equitable transition is another piece of the puzzle where the global community can play such an important role.
Thank you so much for sharing those concrete examples. And I'm sure everybody here is taking notes, and you're going to get to work on this together. In the face of intensifying climate impacts, communities are beginning to realize the need for fundamental shifts, and they're acting accordingly to reduce massive human displacement. The overarching message from both Rebecca and Justine is that there are still gaps in evidence-based data and resources for planning and implementing transformative pathways built on solutions that are proactive, not simply reactive. With this in mind, IOM and the UN Environment Program have developed a strong partnership to address this gap and look critically at the nexus of human mobility and the environment. It is my pleasure to now welcome Pablo Escobino, IOM's regional thematic specialist. Pablo supports IOM's engagement on the relationship between migration, the environment, and climate change in the countries of the Americas and the Caribbean from the IOM regional office in San Jose, Costa Rica. Pablo, thank you so much for joining us. Now, you've been looking at how human mobility issues intersect with climate and environmental changes in Central America and Mexico. Could you please share some examples of how migration as a result of disasters, environmental degradation, and climate change are affecting these countries?
Yes, Tolo, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your introduction. So I think that as you said, we've conducted an assessment in the 7 countries of Central America and Mexico with UNEP, right? And we've seen what's the evidence in these countries about the relationship between human mobility, climate change, and disasters. And I think that one of the first things we need to consider is how heterogeneous this region is, right? I mean, there's no one single Central America. There's multiple countries, multiple ecosystems. And populations in these countries are affected very differently by climate change and sudden onset hazards. I think we also have to consider, however, that the region is very exposed to different hazards. We have talked much about climatic processes, including tropical storms, droughts, sea level rise, but these hazards are also compounded by other vulnerabilities, including a history of earthquakes in the region and volcanic eruptions recently in Guatemala, for instance, right? So we have a very exposed region in our hands here. Now that's for the, let's say, the natural angle, right? But I think it's important to consider how vulnerable the communities are at the social level, right? Because we often say that natural hazards do not happen in a vacuum, but they happen in societies which have compounded social, economic, and political challenges, right? We're talking about countries that have high levels of labor market informality and limited levels of social protection. Some of them have violence issues, conflict challenges, others have political issues at stake. And so climate and environmental factors do pile on to these drivers, right? And potentially they provoke various forms of human mobility. When we look as Oveis in particular does from a climate standpoint, we often speak about different categories, let's say, of human mobility, right? In particular, since the Cancun adaptation framework. And these forms of mobility do happen in Central America and Mexico. The first one is disaster displacement, and it's often associated with sudden onset hazards. And we have many examples of these, right? But we could, as Michelle did, basically look a month back and the impact of hurricanes Eta and Ayora in Honduras and Nicaragua, and the disaster displacement it produces, right? These are populations that have to leave their houses because a hazard is coming their way and have just impacted their communities. And this disaster displacement is quite, at the same time, there's not a single picture of it. Some communities or some populations may go back to their homes. In other cases, we may have situations of protracted displacement, and IOM's initial assessments in Honduras in particular do show that some families which are currently sheltered, they cannot go back to their communities because their houses are entirely destroyed, right? So we may have instances of productive displacement in populations that cannot go back and that are going to need to find durable solutions elsewhere. The second form of mobility after displacement is related to more voluntary forms of migration, right? So these are households that can displace some agency and can move to adapt to the progressive impacts of environmental change. And Rebecca did mention, right, that there have to be options for populations to move voluntarily, to find options elsewhere, and to look for alternatives when they can see that there's a progressive impact of environmental change in agricultural productivity, in water availability. And obviously we have porous borders between migration and displacement, right? But typically with migration, we would be thinking about gradual movements, and that are often consistent with more regular migration processes, and in particular with urbanization in Central America. Central America is a region that has urbanized quite fast, and part of it is related to environmental degradation in areas of origin, in rural areas, where populations have had to live because of many drivers working together to cities. And the third category is the category of planned relocation, right, which is a bit less known in our region and less understood, right? But we're talking about communities that are moved potentially with the involvement of authorities to limit their exposure, right? So you would think about communities that are taken from one place that was exposed and have been moved somewhere else. And these are very challenging processes. So we have examples of this in countries like Nicaragua, and a very interesting process in Panama, in islands, in the Gunayala area, where communities are discussing relocation options because sea level is rising, and islands may become not habitable in the future, and people may have to move to the mainland. So these are some examples of these categories that we have and that we work on: displacement, migration, and planned relocation. But I think just to finish, it's important to also think about the people who may not be able to move or will not want to move, right? And they're exposed to climate hazards, but they may have limited economic means to move, or they may not have skills they can transfer somewhere else. So they may be in very vulnerable situations. So it's important to think about this in mobility scenarios in the region as well.
Thank you so much for that, Pablo. Thank you for walking us through those examples, which really show the complex forms that environmental migration takes in the region. Now, I have to tell you, we have been discussing the major challenges that have emerged in this area, but please, I need some good news. So are there any positive changes in terms of policy making? And if so, how are countries working to address these problems?
Yes, thank you very much, Tolu. So I think, let's say a positive note that I think Rebecca mentioned as well, growing level of, and most data is related to disasters who do have an increasing corpus of evidence, right? That's recognized by the IPCC. So we know much better now how environmental migration occurs in the region. So that's very positive, because that evidence it's what's going to help us in designing and implementing interventions. We also have new engagement from countries, and we're witnessing really positive change at the national and regional levels. Last week, I think it was, the Secretary General Guterres published its report on the advancement of the Global Compact on Migration. And the Global Compact does have very interesting, very innovative wording on environmental migration. And the SG report does mention the progress that's been made in countries like Guatemala and Belize, right? So Guatemala last year included a chapter on human mobility in its adaptation strategy that has clear commitments on capacity building, on research, on policy making. Belize, IOM is working with Belize to also integrate human mobility in climate strategy. So that's really progressive change, right? And the new wave of NDCs are also showing some positive change, right? So Costa Rica, as Michelle said, it wants to include migration in its NDC. Grenada also did mention how the diaspora can be involved in climate adaptation. So we do see progressive change in how countries are including mobility and migration in their climate policies. We're also seeing at the regional level entities like the Regional Conference on Migration, the Central American Integration Process, also working towards a stronger action on climate migration. The Central American Commission on Environment and Development has committed to better understanding and better approaching environmental migration, and IOM is also supporting them in this process. So all of this speaks to positive change in how countries approach environmental migration. There are obviously still shortcomings and challenges, including the need to break silos, to have a more regular engagement between migration stakeholders, disaster risk reduction agencies, climate change entities, but we can see progress that needs to be supported and encouraged in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that information. Now, I'd like to bring in our next panelist, Dan Start, the Regional Humanitarian Affairs Officer at the UN Environment Program. Dan coordinates the Disasters and Conflict Program for the Latin America office, covering 33 countries, focusing on response to emergencies, addressing the environmental drivers and impact of human mobility, mainstreaming environment into humanitarian action, and addressing the relationship between the environment and relationship. Dan, I have to tell you, I'm exhausted simply reading everything that you do. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, while we've been discussing the impact of environmental change on migration, it is also important to address how migration itself can have significant environmental implications. Can you share some of your insights in this area?
Thank you, Tolu. As I see it, there are 4 different kinds of environmental impacts resulting from migration and human mobility. So you have the impacts of the movements of large numbers of people, the impacts of the survival strategies that people on the move then have to adopt, the impacts of the humanitarian response to the needs of people on the move, and then also the environmental impacts which can arise from attempts to either control or frustrate migration. So if we look firstly at the impacts of the movements of large numbers of people, you have the caravan phenomenon, which has developed particularly in Central America over the last number of years, where in order to have security, people move in large groups up through the Central American corridor towards the United States in particular. And this is a logical response to questions of security and the need for safety in numbers, particularly considering the context of insecurity that exists in many of these countries. But when you have larger numbers of people, you also have greater strain, for example, on systems of waste management for people to be able to dispose of the waste that they produce while they're on the move, food waste, sanitation, etc. And often they're passing through areas where there are very few public services. In other parts of the world, but still in Latin America, in fact, in South America, you have the phenomenon of walkers. So here, rather than taking public transport or going on trucks, this is actually a kind of a disorganized phenomenon in the sense that there is much less coordination. But you have people who are unable to pay for their transport costs, who are literally walking and occasionally hitchhiking, normally from Venezuela at least as far as Colombia, but sometimes going even as far as Peru or Chile to reach their final destination. And there, for example, you also have impacts primarily related to waste management, because when people come down from colder highlands into warmer lowlands, they have to abandon the clothing that they accumulated because they just cannot be carrying large volumes of clothing, of baggage, etc. And so then you have these kind of points of accumulation of waste as people sort of transition from one environmental context to another. And the lack of sanitation systems then also means that potentially you'll find people who either cannot find or simply there are no available sanitation systems for them. So then we have an issue of people having to defecate in the open, etc. And lastly, you have migration routes which sometimes have to cross protected areas, potentially because of a need to pass unnoticed, because either of violence or of anti-migration control measures put in place by different countries. And so then you have potential environmental impacts on protected areas when people have to take those routes. The survival strategies that people on the move have to adopt may sometimes involve, for example, incorporation in the informal economy, but particularly we've noticed things like scavenging and recycling, taking waste and then trying to separate out the usable parts of the waste in order to resell as kind of informal recyclers or waste vendors what can be salvaged. But this is not always an environmentally neutral activity, because what cannot be salvaged is not always potentially well disposed of. In border areas, you occasionally have the import of animal products from one country to another. So for example, it might be milk or cheese for sale on the local market, normally immediately on the other side of the border. And there potentially you have animal products which have not necessarily been pasteurized or appropriately controlled. And then the growth of informal settlements, when migrants often find themselves forced to stay in the most marginal of informal settlements due to a lack of alternative options and due to control measures on the move, which force them to stay in one place for different periods of time, for bureaucratic reasons, or because simply they need to stop in one place to try and accumulate money in order to carry on the journey. But it's also worth noting that the livelihoods that people adopt can be environmentally beneficial when this is facilitated. And I'll come on to this in a minute, because then we have the environmental impacts of the humanitarian response to people on the move. And the humanitarian response can be also have its own kind of negative environmental consequences. The construction of shelters can lead to construction waste, and then the operation of shelters can also potentially lead to waste in terms of packaging, food waste, depending on the food provision systems that are put in place, wastewater or environmental impacts due to water extraction, sanitation systems, and then with that there's an issue of community relations as well, because migrants are generally blamed for the impact of the humanitarian services which are given to them, even though in practice they don't necessarily get to say how water should be provided, how sanitation should be set up. Most migrants want to carry on the journey. Pablo referred to people being likely to stay in shelters for long periods in Honduras, and they're not even necessarily looking at crossing the border and leaving the country, but they've lost their homes and they have nowhere else to go. And this is something that I saw when I was in Honduras up until last week, that there are a lot of people whose houses are simply destroyed, they cannot go back to them, or their communities are no longer inhabitable. Then also you have the humanitarian response in terms of the provision of water and sanitation. And there are good practices that can be used to make sure that there is not over-extraction of water from aquifers or strain on the water table, but this needs to be very carefully managed. But there are at the same time opportunities whereby the humanitarian response to people on the move can do positive things. There's an example in Brazil working with the response to people on the move coming from Venezuela and Brazil. The Brazilian government has an initiative called interiorization, which looks to relocate people from the northern border states into other states in Brazil where they want to remain in Brazil and find them a place to stay and work in the formal economy. And this is a very positive response to the large numbers of people on the move coming into Brazil. And what UN Environment has done in that case is work together with UNHCR to look at what opportunities there might be in the green jobs labor market to try and incorporate people coming from Venezuela into strengthening the green economy. So that might be, for example, working in national parks, it might be working in the formal waste management sector, it might be working in ecotourism, and looking at the overall opportunity in the labor market for green jobs in Brazil and how people on the move can incorporate into that labor market. Then lastly, there's the environmental impacts of the response of attempts to control or frustrate the flows of people. So border closures is the key one. Michelle Klein-Solomon referred to border closures, which have happened on various occasions in response to migrant caravans and now in response to the pandemic. But this leads to an accumulation of people in border areas who cannot move on, and then the overloading of shelters in those frontier communities. And then obviously the closures and restrictions associated with the pandemic increase this phenomenon further because you have a buildup of people with nowhere else to go. And then there's also the issue of evictions and demolitions, particularly from informal settlements, which are not only populated by people on the move, but migrants and refugees often have no choice when they arrive in a large city but to stay in the most economical areas, or the areas where they're least likely to suffer excessive costs, and that's normally in informal areas. But then evictions and demolitions often have their own environmental impact as well, sometimes even including burning informal settlements. So most environmental impacts result from either a lack of preparation or from attempts to frustrate or restrict the movement of people. I've never seen any evidence that people on the move willfully harm the environment in their points of transit or their points of destination. Where their strategies may not be environmentally beneficial, it's due to lack of choice. And where humanitarian actors do not consider the environment in their responses to people on the move, it's normally the refugees and migrants who will then be blamed for any local environmental impacts, rather than the agencies that actually didn't necessarily either consider or have the resources to consider those impacts when they set up their responses to the humanitarian needs of refugees and migrants. Border closures and movement restrictions tend to increase those impacts further. So I think it's important that we don't get into migrant blaming and kind of feeding the myths around migrants and refugees, because the biggest environmental impacts are not caused by them. They're normally caused by either a response which doesn't consider the environment, or by attempts to frustrate their passage. But it's also worth noting that the response to people on the move can be environmentally beneficial if we try to go beyond a simple assistance model and stop assuming that human mobility is only a short-term phenomenon, and start looking at how actually can we turn this into an opportunity to generate a positive environmental impact.
That's incredibly helpful to know. Now, looking at your assessment, what are some of the major priorities that you've identified to enable better action at the nexus of migration at the environment? Because I think you made an incredible point there about not blaming the migrants, blaming the victims in many instances. What are the actions that can be taken to make sure that we don't have this push and pull?
I think it's important to firstly look at the body of evidence that there is in the research that is available. Pablo mentioned a lot of kind of positive developments in terms of understanding the phenomenon better, but it's important to try and bring that research together so that, for example, migration management organizations also feel that they own the research around climate mobility, rather than thinking of that as being kind of something that's either more social or more environmental and outside of their mandate. So I think there's definitely an element of needing to sort of break down the silos and to develop research that really sort of brings these issues together, rather than sort of develop research within pockets. Because the research on the environmental causes and impacts of human mobility has still tended to be, while the research body is growing, it's still tended to be quite siloed. And there's definitely a need to bring that together. I think along with that, there's a need to move the humanitarian and the media analysis of human mobility and the causes and impacts of human mobility beyond the sensational and beyond the gory. Although violence and food insecurity may contribute to people's decision to leave home, the decision to leave home also often arises from a cocktail of reasons, which include environmental and socioeconomic, as well as issues related to protection and insecurity. So I've just come back from the UN response mission in Honduras, where I was shown how the impact of hurricanes has been getting progressively worse over the years. And there's already talk of an increase in migration out of Honduras following this year's hurricane season. So I think it's important to try and look at not only how people leaving a country can be kind of motivated by insecurity in that country, but also to try and look at, well, what are the other drivers behind that? Because even when economic reasons are identified as drivers for migration, in a region like Central America, the underlying environmental dynamic is rarely explored. But this is a region where agriculture is one of the biggest sources of work, where drought and hurricanes wipe out agricultural production, and with it the opportunities that agricultural day laborers rely on. and I interviewed a lot of agricultural day laborers, or jornaleros as they're often called in Central America, who now know that they will not have work probably for the next 6 months because 2 production seasons have been wiped out. So now it's kind of increasingly clear that there are environmental dynamics behind people's decision to leave home, and that needs to be reflected in the research and policy decisions that we're making. I think it's also important to look at the question of capacity. How can we integrate environment into the response to the needs of people on the move? It's one thing to say we need to do it, it's another thing to know how that should be done, because it's very contextually specific. And we need to recognize that slowing people on the move down without giving them a sustainable alternative is only going to lead to further unintended environmental impacts. Closing borders, evicting people from settlements without providing feasible options is not a sustainable solution. So there needs to be dialogue between environment and migration management actors on how the priorities of each can be met and how they can have the capacity to develop and implement joint responses to manage human mobility in a sustainable way, balancing human rights, the environment, and national migration priorities. And so along with that, we need to have the policies that will work together to facilitate this. Many humanitarian agencies now recognize that they could do more on these issues, but they also recognize that they cannot easily assign resources to address environmental issues if donors are not demanding this and are not funding it. And if the environmental sources of funding are primarily assigned to longer term questions, which are highly relevant, but the environmental impacts often tend to be kind of on a much shorter time horizon. So there needs to be a change in donor priorities to reflect environmental concerns in humanitarian response, and also paradoxically to reflect humanitarian concerns in environmental response. The Fiji Climate Relocation Trust Fund example mentioned by my colleague from UN Climate Change is a really good example of donor engagement on this issue, but this needs to become the norm, and not an example of good practice in funding and policy making from one region only. Since human mobility is often a regional issue rather than being confined to just one country, there needs to be greater support to develop regional policy on the issue and reduce this tendency towards pushing the issue outside of one's own country borders, which then strains the environment of the country next door without actually necessarily solving the problem. So I think we can try and work on this through increasing the body of kind of integrated research rather than siloed research, working on capacity to then develop responses and policy based on that body of evidence, and breaking down some of those gaps between humanitarian, environment, and migration management.
Thank you so much, Dan. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I do understand that we are fast running out of time. But if you will bear with us for another 5 minutes or so, I'd like to invite all of our panelists back, Rebecca, Justine, Pablo, and Dan. We were going to do a full-on Q&A section here with questions from the audience, but when we saw that we were running over time, we switched gears and have been answering your questions as they come in through the chat. But there is one question that is burning that I really want to get the perspective of our incredible panelists on. In as few words as you can manage, what are the opportunities that the international community working with the private sector have to prevent climate-induced human displacement as we move into the post-pandemic recovery phase? Dan, since we left off on you, I'll go ahead and start back up with you again.
Thank you. So I think that we hear a lot about how the pandemic is an opportunity to avoid going back to the way things were. And I guess there's almost an expectation that we need to do things differently. So we could start looking at this as an opening to promote thinking outside of the box in terms of addressing environment and human mobility, because the pandemic is fundamentally an environmental event. It's a zoonotic disease born from animals with the contagion initially being due to excess human and urban pressures on natural resources and animal habitats. And then the spread comes from globalization, which is in itself a form of human mobility. So if we recognize that this is an opportunity for humanity's relationship with the environment to change, so we might also be able to grab the nettle and recognize that we need to rethink how we develop policy and practice related to human mobility and our relationship to the environment. There needs to be a willingness to make those leaps, and rather than just go back to looking for the familiar comfort of the way things used to be as soon as we have a vaccine, and actually try and make the jump and recognize that this is a fundamentally environmental event, which ultimately would not have become a pandemic if it weren't for the fact that we are now a globalized world and we all travel. So there's an opportunity here so long as we want to grab it.
Thank you so much. Next up, could we have Rebecca?
Sure, thanks very much. Fully agree with what Dan has been saying, and particularly the part about rechanneling aid, foreign support, to the places where it's most needed. And I guess something that I could add to that is that, there is a lot more that we could be doing with data to inform those decisions. I mean, we can't pretend anymore that we don't know that these kind of crises are coming. That the writing is on the wall, the data is there. We still hear arguments that it's not certain enough, and it's not for all decisions, but we can at least make more decisions than we have. We can at least rule out bad options, or just pretend that we don't know, stop pretending that we don't know what's happening. Just as an example, some of my colleagues have developed a way of mapping out water and conflict. So pulling together different data layers to see where conflict is most likely to arise, so that those are the places where we can pay particular attention and, hopefully avoid crisis, and particularly the types of crisis that leave people with few options except for to migrate. I think I'll leave it at that, given how short time is.
Thank you so much. Pablo?
Yes, thank you very much, Tolu. Yeah, I don't have much more to add, but I would say that so as countries think about what the recovery looks like, right? I think we do have a global framework that we can rely on, right? And the private sector can engage on them, but we do have things like the SDGs, right? And in particular, I'm thinking about the climate SDG. I think it's 13, but which says climate change should be mainstreamed everywhere, right? And it is about that, right? And it's about thinking, right, we're gonna do recovery. We gotta look at what that means from a climate perspective, right? Climate sensitive adaptation, mitigation. We have the new waves of NDCs, and human mobility needs to be in there as well, right? So I think we have the frameworks, we have the Global Compact on Migration, we have the SDGs, we have the Paris Agreement that Ove so rightly discussed. So I think looking at those and thinking, right, what do they mean in this very concrete moment is sort of the way to go, right? And there's opportunities for engagement with the private sector on those, with governments, with international organizations. So that would be my message, maybe.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Justine.
Thank you, Tolu. I don't have much to add either, because I think it was said so well, but I think the one thing that I would highlight is the private sector seems to like to focus on one issue at a time. And I think the intersectionality that was highlighted here was so critical. So looking at climate and health and issues that affect women and that intersectionality, and taking the private sector on a journey of understanding and funding ultimately at intersections, I think is really important. And I think the pandemic more than anything has demonstrated the need for preparedness in a way that is so fundamental. So I would just add that.
Thank you so much. And if you would bear with me, there is one burning question that we got, and we'll close on this question. There's a question from the audience about how we can infuse policy making with indigenous perspectives, specifically for Kiribati that did not cause the problem. How can we assist to protect them, and what are your views and how we can effectively move forward? I'm just going to throw that out in general to our incredible panelists. Anyone is welcome to pick up that question.
And maybe I can quickly start, and then colleagues may contribute, right? I think the question is very relevant, and I'm not sure. So for what we've been saying about how important it is to address this issue, I think we all agree that there's no single way to address this issue, right? So there's different approaches you can look at, right? So obviously it goes through climate mitigation first, right? Because that entails, I mean, there's evidence from the IPCC in particular, the 1.5 report, that the more climate change is mitigated, the less pressure there's going to be on populations, right? So mitigation is obviously the first thing you could think about, but then there's also adaptation, right? And we've said that there needs to be a component of adaptation, local adaptation in situ and potentially transformative adaptation. Then there's obviously the perspective of disaster risk reduction, improved disaster reduction, disaster preparedness, limit the exposure of communities, and then the mobility responses as well. So I'm not sure there's a single way to do it. I think there's all pieces of this very complex puzzle, and they all contribute to protecting populations, right? And the situation of small island developing states is obviously critical, right? And planned relocation, we've talked about it, is a component of it, and maybe even the potential of cross-border relocation of populations may come if strong actions are not taken in the very near future.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add a thought?
Tolu, very quickly from my side. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Very quickly, just on that indigenous people's engagement, and in our organization and the platform, we have something referred to as LCIPP, Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform, that was established some years ago, an extremely important platform where we value the input, engagement, participation of indigenous people from all over the world, and they collectively provide their experiences, ancestral and very, very valuable experience on how best to address the impacts of climate change and adaptation. And that has been brought into our process, on which some very, very key decisions have been made. I have shared the link in the Q&A, and I invite everyone to take a look at that. But that's an extremely very valuable, very powerful platform which brings indigenous people from various parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thanks for staying on through this entire program. I would love to just take a pandemic moment and ask all of our incredible speakers to turn on their cameras so we can take, you know, those like shots that you take when you all come on stage and you line up and you're like, is this over yet? No, it's not. I have to sit here and smile. We're going to do a virtual version of one of those. So if I could have all of our speakers just turn on their cameras, and we're going to grab a screenshot and then roll into the closing of the program. Great. Fantastic. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, but again, we are so unfortunately out of time. This inspiring conversation is a critical first step in advancing from understanding to collective action, but it is merely the beginning. Vulnerable communities around the world are experiencing the devastating effects of the climate crisis. If climate change continues at the current rate, human displacement and mobility crisis will worsen, and in both magnitude and severity. But a more sustainable and equitable global society is achievable and worth fighting for together. This concludes our dialogue. Though our journey to address climate migration continues, USA for IOM will send a follow-up email to all registered participants with details on our call to action in Honduras. It will also include information on further opportunities to support developing countries adapt to climate change and build resilience. So please be on the lookout for that email. I would once again like to thank every single one of our speakers. We are so incredibly grateful for you spending your morning, afternoon, or evening here with us, and to all of our participants for staying so incredibly engaged. Thank you. I am Tolu Olubumi, and it has been my pleasure to guide you through today's discussion. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe, engaged, and take care.
Thank you very much, and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.